Thank you, and I'd like to thank Wendy and colleagues at the FRCN for inviting me in Black History Month to give this talk. This is a real honor for me because yesterday was an incredibly special day for me personally. Yesterday was the 40th year, exactly the 40th year since I started in the NHS at Central Middlesex Hospital, and for me, 40 years. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's fantastic. Thank you all so much. Yesterday was also a very interesting day for other reasons. We know it was World Mental Health Day, and a lot of us celebrated that. And actually the fact that mental health is coming to the fore and we're all talking much more about mental health so that we're getting rid of some of that stigma, which was fantastic. But also yesterday, and many of you will know this, Theresa May published the first race disparity audit. And many of you would have seen on the news people talking about race and the differences in experience of people of color in this country in terms of race. And some of what I'm going to talk about tonight is going to be quite uncomfortable for some people to hear, but it's factual. It's about our history. I've written down quite a lot, so I will be looking down, but I will also be looking up and looking at all of you to get a response to some of the things that I'm going to be saying this evening. So again, thank you so much for being here. Black History Month is an opportunity for us to celebrate. It's an opportunity for us to celebrate our blackness. It's an opportunity for the country to know and understand what we, as black and ethnic minority people, have brought to this country. The richness of our diversity, the richness of our cultures, to help this country to be what it is today. And I think that a lot of people will say, well, actually, not too sure about that because the country would prefer preferably not to be in this place, and some people would prefer the country to be as it was. We know that. How do we know that? Because we had a Brexit vote not too long ago, and though people talk about the fact that we voted for Brexit for all sorts of reasons to leave the EU, if you talk to people, it's mostly about immigration, and it's mostly about immigrants coming to this country and taking jobs and all sorts of other things that immigrants have supposed to have done. But nobody talks about what we have brought, about the amount of goodwill that we have brought to the country. So the contributions that we have made will be celebrated during Black History Month. We are given the legitimacy to talk about it in this month. And the 1 month of the year, we can start to talk about and celebrate our greatness. Now, for many years, I have been a nurse, and I'm still a nurse now. And today, it was wonderful. I'm just going to go a bit off piece. I actually was on the stage with the marvelous Elizabeth Anayonwu, Dame Elizabeth. And there was a lot of talk about the time when she was growing up in the NHS. I remember being in Brent when Elizabeth was in Brent back in 1977, and she was already making inroads into being the fabulous and wonderful person that she is today. And what we're talking about are those celebrations and those people with their achievements and their accomplishments and all the adversity they've had to face. And make no mistake, for black and ethnic minority people in this country, it is not easy. This is not an easy gig, being black in a white-dominated society. And tonight, I am going to talk about being black, being from an ethnic minority in a white-dominated society. Now, all of you will know that the world that we're living in has a power structure. And that power structure is one that is dominated at the very top by people from white backgrounds. And we know this because a couple of weeks ago, actually, and some of you will have seen this. Did anybody see the color of power? Did anybody take time to look at the website of The Colour of Power that was launched, published 2 weeks ago, I think? The Colour of Power. Google it. Have a look. And you'll see, not this minute, not now, but what you'll see are the people who actually run the country. And you'll also see the colour of their skins. And in our NHS, it actually shows who those people are. So when Wendy asked me to talk, and she gave me the freedom to talk about what I wanted to talk about, gave me the license to just be Yvonne Coghill and talk about what I wanted to talk about, I decided I was going to talk about black people's resilience, their strength, their fortitude, their drive, and their energy. And she was brave enough to trust me to be able to do this in a way that would actually hold all of you and not offend people, but actually I'll talk the truth. So we're not making any mistake or any illusion about the difficulty it is in being black. It's hard. It takes a long time for people of colour to get half as far as people with less melanin in their skin. We have to work harder. We're told by our parents, you have to work hard. There's nowhere to go with it. It has to be done. And we know that if you're from a black and ethnic minority background, we have so much evidence that shows that actually you're more likely to die earlier. You are more likely to have chronic diseases. You are less likely to make as much money over your lifetime. And this is not just in this country. This is all white-dominated countries like Canada and America and Australia and New Zealand. So we know that the issue that we're dealing with isn't just one that we're dealing with in the NHS and actually here. Earlier this year, I was really fortunate to go to Washington, and I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure and the joy of going to the new museum there, the Natural History Museum of African American Culture. Anybody been yet? If you haven't been and you go to Washington, it's something that you have to do. But take your tissues with you. My cousin and I cried all the way around. We were distraught with some of the things that we saw, some of the things that we heard. And what we looked at and stayed with quite a lot was the transatlantic slave trade and the experience of enslaved people. The slave trade was finally abolished in 1865, we know that. But the reason why it came into being was as a consequence of economics. People wanting to make lots of money and making money off of other people. And those people happen to be predominantly African people. And it was a horror, wasn't it? It's a horror that we don't usually think about. Being dragged away from your home, put onto that ship or those ships. I don't know, many of us have seen the pictures. You are cheek by jowl, naked, shackled, and you're put into the bowels of a ship, and not like the big liners that we have these days, if any of you have been on cruises, but quite rough and ready vessels that took to the Atlantic Ocean. And the figures are really stark in that we know that 10 million Africans were transported to America. We know that. We know that 6 million of them actually died. So that's 16 million already. And 4 million evaded capture and rather than actually go, killed themselves. So how many millions of people are we talking about here that went through that hellish horror that was the transatlantic slave trade? And I said to myself when I was looking at these things, I could not have survived. And many of you might ask yourselves, particularly the African Caribbeans amongst you, would I have survived that journey? What would it have been like for me? And somebody said to me, you know what, Yvonne, you would have survived because you are here and your forebears survived. Because if they hadn't, you wouldn't be here. So that strength, that tenacity must be within you and all the African Caribbeans and African Americans who have survived. They come from strong stock. Because what I've described already is how awful and how brutal that oppression was for people of color at that time. And I think we ought to remember those people. We talk about it, but we don't actually sit and think what it must have been like to be in that situation. So the tears that me and my cousin were shedding as we went around that museum were tears for our forebears, but also tears for ourselves, I think, about being black in white society and what it actually takes. 250 years it went on, enslaved people working and making other people rich and building other people's countries to be powerful and wonderful. And when the slave trade came to an end, what did these people get for their troubles? They got their freedom. What more could they ask for? There was no reparation for the enslaved people. But the slave owners, of course, and people who were running it, actually, were recompensed for loss of income. Hard stuff that we have to listen to and hear. And the residue of some of the beliefs about black and ethnic minority people are still with us today. Because in order to oppress people, you had to actually start making stories about their lack of worth and their lack of value. And all sorts of things come into the mix to keep people of color in their place. So this hierarchy of color, the residue of which still lives with us today, is one of the things that happened. So the darker you are, the more likely you are to work in the fields. And the lighter your skin, the more likely you are to be in the house. Has that changed today in terms of how things work out for people in our society? Would it surprise you to know that the darker your skin and the more African you appear, the less your life chances are? Across the globe, we have evidence that shows that. And in our own NHS, Professor Mike West did a lot of work last year. And in the document, Making the Difference, you can see, in terms of discrimination, who says they feel that they are more discriminated against. And it happens to be black people. And if you look at the RCN document, document on midwifery, and who actually loses their jobs or lost their jobs over the last 5 years, you'll see very clearly that black Africans are in the mix. So this thing that started all of those years ago is still very real and still exists within our society today. So this month we need to remember those people and think about all of their achievements and what they did and how they fought to be the best they could be against adversity and how they actually came together to become strong because they had no choice, they had to. It was important. And all of those things that bind all of those people together bind some of us together as well. And it's really important that we think about that and remember that during our Black History Month. And if you aren't somebody that reads a lot, I would recommend that you go back and have a look at the history of this country and how this country was built and where that money came from. Some of you will hear from my accent that I grew up in Bristol. Bristol's an interesting place. And I suppose at the time when I was growing up, I didn't really understand its history. And to this day, you can go to White Ladies Road and Black Boy Hill and all sorts of places in Bristol that were built on the back of the slave trade. This country has a lot of history around that time in terms of the enslaved people and the money that was made from them. And so to 2017, and amazingly and probably surprisingly to people, we're still working hard to achieve equity. Notice I say equity and not equality. Because if we're looking at equality, it means doing the same thing for everybody. But we don't want the same thing for everybody because everybody comes from a different place. So we're looking at equity. And all of this is pretty depressing stuff, and all of you are looking at me and thinking, oh my God, when's she going to start saying something that's a bit more positive about all of this? But it's really important that we actually set the context, right? So last year, when Theresa May decided she was going to do the race disparity audit, I was really excited about that. It's phenomenal, actually. Theresa May is a Tory. And when she came into power, she decided she was going to actually do something about race equality, which was fascinating because lots of other politicians sort of mentioned it and so on. But this was really new. This was looking in depth and detail at the experiences of people of colour in 2017 Great Britain. And yesterday it was published, and it's really interesting reading. Because what it says is exactly what was said 40 years ago when I first started in the NHS. That people of colour have a poorer experience. So something has to be done about it. And what do you think should be done about it? Because what we're talking about is 400 years of this thing called oppression, discrimination. You can call it what you like. But they weren't calling it that on TV yesterday. There was all sorts of other excuses for what was going on. And what is she going to do with all of this? Why has she dragged all of this up? What's going to happen next? It was really interesting, the response to that report yesterday. So most of you work in the NHS, right? Does everybody work in the NHS? Most people work for or to the NHS. You don't? But most people have used the NHS or know the NHS. And in 2014, Simon Stevens, the chief executive of NHS England, decided he was going to do something about race equality in the NHS. Not because he was a good man and he thought it was the right moral thing to do. Yes, that's one of them. Not because actually all these black and ethnic minority people weren't getting to senior level positions in the NHS, but because he recognized, because of the evidence, that it saves lives and saves money to treat all staff well, to treat all staff with dignity and respect, and to value everybody. That's the key, to make sure that that's what we do. That's what everybody does. That's what everybody should do. Now, in our NHS, shouldn't that happen? We are a values-driven organisation. We have the NHS Constitution. Do we live by it? Do we make sure that everybody has equal experiences when they access our services? No, we don't. But more than that, our staff don't have equal experiences. I told you that I've been in the NHS for 40 years. I'm a nurse, I'm a mental health nurse, health visitor, I've got 2 master's degrees, I've got lots of qualifications. But could I become a director of nursing? No. I went for 5 director of nursing jobs, but I was never good enough. There was always somebody else better on the day. It took me 38 years of my time in the NHS to become a director of the Workforce Race Equality Standard. And I met with my colleagues on Friday night who were in my set 18 at Central Middlesex Hospital. There was 10 of us. There was 24 in the set, mostly from white backgrounds, and there was 4 of us from black and ethnic minority backgrounds in the set. Most of my colleagues, who I started with back in 1977, became directors 20, 25 years ago. For me, and my other colleagues from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, a couple are still doing health visiting, not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm doing what I'm doing, and another one of them has left the NHS. So it never happened for any of us that we became directors of nursing in the NHS. Do you know how many black and ethnic minority directors of nursing we have in the NHS out of our 450,000 nurses? Have a guess. And that's nurses that are working in, chief nurses that are working in hospitals or in the community, who are chief nurses and sit at the board and can make decisions. Go on, have a guess. Throw me a number. 4. Who said 4? Yeah, you're right. We would have had another one, but she's sitting in the audience over here, and she's left the hospital, and she's now working in NHS England. So we have very few people of colour, nurses. Is that right? Is that fair? Is that equitable? When I've told you all that I've told you about black and ethnic minority people coming to this country and working incredibly hard to make sure everything stacks up. So that is one of the reasons why Simon Stevens decided that he was going to launch the Workforce Race Equality Standard. The Workforce Race Equality Standard is I think probably, and I would say this, wouldn't I? It's probably the most important programme in the NHS today. It is about looking at your black staff and your white staff and looking at the experience of both and closing the gap on that experience, because there is a gap in their experiences. So if you look at what they call the Workforce Race Equality Standard and the 9 indicators, do you all know the Workforce Race Equality Standard? People are saying maybe not. This is a mandated program where all organizations have to send us their data. And the data measures black experience and white experience. And you can look online and see where your trust is on all of those indicators, all 9 of them. And some of the indicators are about whether or not you will be shortlisted, be appointed from shortlisting. And the national average is that you are more likely to be 1.57 times more likely to be appointed if you're from a white background than if you're from a black background. You're twice as likely to be disciplined if you're from a black background. This is just averages. Because what you probably don't know is that London happens to be the worst place in the country for the Workforce Race Equality Standard gaps. Now, why would that be, do you think? Bearing in mind that most organizations have many, many more black and ethnic minority people than they have across the whole of the country. But the disciplinary levels are really high. And in some organizations in London, you are 6 times more likely to be disciplined if you're from a black background than if you're from a white background. You're 5 times more likely, less likely, I beg your pardon, to get a job than if you're from a white background. This is in London. This is 2017. This is data that we've just collected. So something is going on in our society that means it's not working very well. And that's why Simon Stevens decided to put a light and focus on race equality, because a lot of people have actually said, well, why race? What about women? What about LGBT? What about? And what he has said is, we need to focus on this because this has been going on for too long and we haven't really cracked this nut. We really need to do something about it. And so my job is to make sure that happens and that we actually pull this together. And the consequences of the RES, the Workforce Race Equality Standard, is that there's nowhere for anyone to hide now. Because in the past, people would say, well, is that true, Yvonne? Really? No, you've got a chip on your shoulder. That's not right. It can't be. Nobody can say that now. Nobody can dispute the data that we have up and down the country. And the enormity and the complexity of the thing called race equality or race inequality is phenomenal. Because what has to happen is that we have to change people's values, their mindset, and behaviors. But more than that, their beliefs. What they believe good looks like. And good doesn't look like me with my hair in cane row and coming from a black and ethnic minority background. And that's the dilemma. And that's the issue that we have. It's tricky, but it's doable. And we have to, all of us, have hope. Somebody was speaking to me today about hope, and that we have to have hope, because if we don't have hope, what's going to happen? Is this how it's going to be for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren? It can't be. We can't allow it to be. It has to change. It has to be different. Many of you won't know Dr. David Williams. Dr. David Williams is a Harvard professor. For me, he's just so brilliant. He's a brilliant man, a black man. And he's the world expert on health and race. And him, along with other colleagues, have been collecting data for many, many years. So we know what to do to make a difference with race equality. We know what has to happen to make the changes in our organization and across the world, actually. What do you think is the number one thing that needs to happen to start making the changes around this agenda? What needs to happen? Sorry? Anybody?
Change of mindset.
Change of mindset. Whose change of mindset? No. So there needs to be a change of mindset, but what we need are leaders who are willing to talk about this. When Theresa May spoke about this yesterday, did anybody hear her talk about oppression? Did anybody hear her talking about discrimination? Did anybody hear her talking about what life is really like for black and ethnic minority people in 2017? We need leaders who can use that terminology. Not people who look like me, or so most of you, but people who look like Theresa May, people who look like Boris Johnson, people who are in positions of power and authority. We need leaders who are going to say, enough, we're not having this anymore in our world. It's going to change, and we need to change it. So that's the first thing you need, and that's the first thing we need in our NHS. When was the last time you heard your chief executive standing up, and I don't want anybody from Northeast London standing up and saying, yes, I've heard it. How many times have you heard your chief executives talking about this issue? Standing up in front of the audience and talking about, I've got one hand up. We need all of our chief executives and senior leaders to be talking about this. So you need leadership. The second thing you need, and we've got that already, are these metrics, measuring the difference between black and white experience and accountability. We need that. We need to make sure that we know that what we're doing is making a difference. But we also need to, thirdly, have communication, good communications. People talking about the things that we're talking about now, and making sure that people understand and know why we're doing it. Not because Yvonne Coghill wants to be Chief Nursing Officer of England, but actually, well, that would be nice, but actually, because it saves patients' lives. It makes patients more satisfied. It makes staff more satisfied. It makes us more productive. It saves money in an NHS that's strapped for cash. Did you know that in London, we have the highest levels of agency staff across the whole of the country? And that costs the country a lot of money. Do you know why that might be? Staff in agencies say their preference is to work freelance because they don't want the aggravation and the trouble. They don't want to get into a situation that's difficult for them by working in an organization. And we have to change that. And the other thing we need is role models. Oh, I'm sorry, I have to keep looking at you. I can't help it. We need people like Elizabeth. We need people like Wendy. We need people who we can look up to and say, yes, I can aspire to be like that person. They've got there, so there must be a way for me to get there too. We don't have that many, but we have a few. And we have to look after them and nurture them and treat them really, really well, all of us, and support them. We need many, many, many more. And finally, we need financial commitment from somewhere, from someone, to understand that if you give the band 4 or 5 or 6 or even 7 this role in inclusion or diversity or race or whatever you want to call it, they're not going to get very far because of the layers, the hierarchy that we have in the NHS. We need to have senior people sitting around the board table, making decisions for the 15% people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds in our country and the 50% that live in London. Walked into Bart's the other day. I was actually really interested to see their board members. There's nobody, and everybody here knows where Bart's is. It's just outside the city and on the east end of London. Huge hospital, 15,500 staff. Not one BME person. No, there was one BME person on the board, and that was the board secretary. Everybody else was from a white background. That cannot be right. And something has to be done about it, and we have to make sure that we do something about it. Have any of you heard of Brian Stevenson? People probably, I've got one down here. He's fantastic and phenomenal. Google him and watch his speech. Because Brian, like David Williams, is a guru around this subject. And he talks about the things that we need to make things better. And one of them is proximity, being close to people that are different to us. And in America, they do the segregation thing really well. And in England, we kind of pat ourselves on the back and say, well, actually, we're not like that. Aren't we? We're not. We are. What happens when a lot of black people move into an area? Huh? Yeah, you get white people moving out. You get white flight. That's what happens. That's what it's called. People, on the whole, and I read this in The Guardian, don't have friends from different races. On the whole, we have people who look like us coming to our houses. Yeah, you might have 1 or 2 people who you work with, but on the whole, you don't. And unless you have that proximity, that closeness to people, to get to understand who they are and what they do, it makes it very, very, very difficult for you to understand who they are. That's the first thing he talks about. The second thing he talks about is changing the narrative. We need to start talking about why things are as they are and start to make the changes that we need to make. The narrative needs to be different. We can't keep talking about the things we talked about in the past and expect to get a different outcome. So we have to start talking about these issues, even though it's difficult and it's hard. And he talks about hope. We have to have hope. Because without it, where are we going to go? What's going to happen? And these uncomfortable conversations have got to be had by all of us. And all that I've talked about means that you, mostly the black and ethnic minority people in the audience and the white people, are going to have to be strong, going to have to be focused, going to have drive and energy and tenacity in order to make sure that we get to where we want to go. And I suppose the thing that I'd like you to take away with tonight from this talk and on this Black History Month is that we are on a journey. And even though it's been a long journey, we have to keep going with that strength and that resilience and that fortitude. The road has been bumpy and it's been difficult. There's been obstacles in the way, but we've climbed over them and we're still here. The road is still in front of us and we still have to walk down it. There will be other obstacles, but I believe that we are going to get over those. I've seen things change in my 40 years in the NHS. Some of it for the better, some of it not so good. But I think this thing that we're grappling with now, and the NHS is grappling with it, I think it's going to make a change for all of you, and particularly for people who are in their 30s and their 40s. I believe that it is going to be different for all of you. And so whilst we remember black and ethnic minority achievements, the Mary Seacoles, the Muhammad Alis, the Nelson Mandelas, the Martin Luther Kings, the Obamas, because we always remember those people in Black History Month. I want you to take a moment and to think about all of you as well, because all of you are instrumental in bringing us to where we are today, as nurses and as black citizens in this society. So it's really important that you think about your worth, your value, and what you bring to the party. Because without you, without all of you, the NHS and our society would not be what it is today, and it would not exist. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you. Thank you.